On today's episode, we come to you live, sort of, from the Columbus Fishing Expo. So after a quick recap, I thought it would be fun to let you, the listeners, sit in on our in-person topwater fishing seminar from the expo in its entirety, including the presentation itself and the follow-up Q&A portions. All that and more on this episode of Tackle Talk.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Dance, and you're listening to Tackle Talk.
Welcome to the Tackle Talk Podcast, brought to you by American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. World-class fishing gear, unmatched personal service. Now, here's your host, Andrew Hayes.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Tackle Talk Podcast, a show that would not exist, would not even reach your eardrums right now if it weren't for the great folks over at American Legacy Fishing. American Legacy Fishing is my favorite tackle shop in the country for three simple reasons. Great prices, great customer service, and it's ran by great people. Those three things truly set them apart from anywhere else that I could be ordering fishing gear from. They have a beautiful showroom with a giant selection in Evansville, Indiana, with some awesome American tackle, your favorite names, but also a huge JDM selection too, if you guys are into that sort of stuff. All your favorite rod and reel brands, or if you're like me and you live somewhere else in the United States, they have some of the best and fastest shipping of any retailer that you'll find. They also have the internet's best selection of high quality, gently used fishing rods and reels that they're constantly updating over on the website. And they have a fantastic loyalty program that you can join called American Legacy Elite that can get you free shipping for every order you make with no minimums, 10% back on every single order that you make with no questions asked, exclusive sales and deals only for Elite members, and a lot more. And if that wasn't enough, they're now doing boat installations on electronics, trolling motors, batteries, and more. All of that from a great family-owned organization in Evansville, Indiana. So go check them out, www.americanlegacyfishing.com. And as always, you can use code TACKLETALK5 to save 5% off your entire order, including sale items. So again, that code is TACKLETALK5 over at www.americanlegacyfishing.com. Okay, we have a few quick things to start off with here before we get into the bulk of the episode. First, a giant thank you to all of you for the awesome feedback from the last 4 weeks of shows from our Breaking the Mold series. So I'm glad you guys really enjoyed those episodes. They were a blast to make. We really appreciate those 4 guys for coming on and sharing their insight and giving us a sneak peek kind of behind the scenes at their design process and their businesses. So again, that was Battle Baits, Clutch Swim Baits, Great Lakes Finesse, and Black Label Tackle, all awesome guys pumping out some awesome products. Okay, next, we owe you guys a quick recap from a few weeks ago from the Major League Fishing side of things as they kicked off the Bass Pro Tour January 30th through February 2nd at Lake Conroe in Texas. So again, I know we're a little bit behind here, but I want to make sure we catch you up to speed, especially because event number 2 is coming right around the corner. So your top 10 in reverse order from Lake Conroe for the BPT: 10th place, Justin Lucas; 9th place, Nick LeBrun; 8th place, Zach Burge; 7th was Drew Gill; 6th place, Jake Lawrence; 5th place, Jacob Wheeler; 4th place, Alton Jones Jr.; 3rd went to Jacob Wall; 2nd, Colby Miller; and 1st place, a cool 150 G's, and your first red trophy of 2025 goes to Justin Cooper. So the third-year Bass Pro Tour angler out of Louisiana notches his first career win on the BPT in the very first event that they have held where those dreaded 3 words forward-facing sonar have actually been restricted. So Major League Fishing announced this year that on the BPT, anglers would only be able to use forward-facing sonar for one of the 3 periods per day, and then they actually have to lock it up the other 2 periods. So anglers now have to come up with a strategy about when they're going to use their forward-facing sonar each day. And not surprisingly, most anglers, at least in this event, seem to opt to use it in the first period of the day. That was most of the cases. Some of them deviated a little bit from that, but for the most part, you saw a heavy majority of people starting off the day with their forward-facing sonar. But it was interesting, and I'll admit, it was kind of nice to watch these guys have to go out there and, blind cast or crank. Now, granted, they were using their live sonar in period 1, so it gives them a pretty good idea of where to target for the rest of the day, but still, I enjoyed it. I think most other people who watched it enjoyed the change that Major League Fishing made here, but time will obviously tell whether this is the final solution or whether this is just kind of a stepping stone in maybe the right direction for whatever comes next. But either way, congratulations to Justin Cooper, your Stage 1 champion for the Major League Fishing Bass Pro Tour in 2025. Okay, everybody, now let's pivot to the main portion of the show today. And as most of you know, this past Friday, Saturday, and Sunday was the Columbus Fishing Expo over here in Columbus, Ohio. And just like what has kind of become a tradition at this point, we had a Tackle Talk booth for all 3 days, and we also led 2 seminars at 2 of the stages at the expo. And I don't really know how to put into words how awesome you guys truly are. It's mind-blowing, it's humbling, and it's just really, really cool. So at the booth, I bet I got to meet hundreds and hundreds of you that listen to this show. And there were lines at the booth seemingly all weekend long for people to stop by and chat and say hi. And you guys don't know how much that means. We had a lot of people say they came from all over the country, not just like the state, not just, a couple towns away, but seriously like all over the country to come hang out. I think the farthest I heard, there was one gentleman that came from Oregon. There was one that came from California, some others from New York, Pennsylvania, I remember Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Michigan. I think there were a couple from Tennessee, and it was just super cool to be able to meet so many of you and so many that might not even be relatively local to me, just from all over the place. And hearing your stories and how much you've grown to love fishing, or how much you've improved as an angler over the past year or two, or talking about your favorite episodes or your favorite guests, or your favorite fishing gear, your favorite rods, your reels, your baits, some really insightful questions that people came up and asked, just some really unique conversations with you all, and that's kind of what it's all about, and that's what I really cherish about these types of events. So whether you came from 10 miles away or 10 hours away, just know that I appreciate each and every one of you. I know we say it at the end of every episode, but I really, really mean that. This past weekend, again, it is humbling to get to sit there and meet you all and just see what a community that you guys have made around this show, and it's chock full of some really, really, really great people. So thank you all. Also, thank you to everybody that stopped by and grabbed some gear. We're low on most things right now, but good news is I'm in the process of doing a restock order of the things that we brought to the expo to give everybody at home that didn't get to make it to the expo a chance to get some of this gear too. So we had some dark army green Tackle Talk shirts. We got some really cool coffee mugs with a smallmouth and largemouth design that I made a few years back. We've got a metal smallmouth keychain, Give 'em the Beans wristbands, and also something that wasn't at the expo. I'm currently working on some brand new hats. So all of that will hit the website hopefully soon. I hope in the next week or two, I'll be able to give you guys a hard date on when all of those things are going to drop on the website so that you guys can be ready. But I know you guys have asked for a lot of new stuff. I'm trying my best to get it together. And the trial run at the expo went really well. I think a lot of people liked it. So that'll be coming pretty soon. And the last thing, a big thank you to everybody that came out to our 2 live seminars that we did on one of my favorite things in the world, Topwater Fishing. So on Friday, we had a great crowd. On Saturday, you guys packed it, looking out from where I was doing the presentation. There really weren't any chairs left. There were people standing around the sides and the back. And again, the common theme here is just going to be a giant thank you. You guys made those 2 seminars a blast. And besides the seminar itself, we had the Q&A section at the end of each of them, which was probably my favorite part. So what I want to do today is kind of let you, the folks at home, be a fly on the wall for one of those seminars. So I recorded the Friday seminar in its entirety, including the Q&A that we're going to let you guys listen to here in a minute. And then on Saturday, it was a very similar seminar, so I'm not going to make you sit through both of them, obviously, but we had a completely different set of questions from the Q&A portion from the crowd. So I'm going to add in the second day's seminar Q&A portion at the end of this as well. So you're going to get the full seminar on topwater fishing and both days worth of Q&A sections that were at the end. So shout out to Greg Thomas over at the Hook Life for helping record day 2 and the Q&A portion there. I hope you guys like this. It's something that we've never actually done on here before, actually playing the recording from inside the show and the live seminar. So I know the audio quality is not going to be what you're used to, but we're in a giant convention center with a microphone system and all that. So I hope this turns out okay. But with that, let's take you back to the Columbus Fishing Expo this past weekend for our live seminar on topwater bass fishing.
Well, I appreciate you guys. Thanks for coming out here. So when they asked me if I would do a seminar, I basically wanted to do it on the most fun thing that I think we can talk about in bass fishing, and that's going to be topwater fishing. So unfortunately right now, not the best time in the world, obviously, to go out and do it, but the time will be right around the corner. So I'd say it seems like around here, February, March, not going to be great. You're going to start to get into April, and you're going to start thinking topwater. So what I wanted to do today was basically try and break it down semi-analytically, right? I think a lot of times with fishing, it's like if you look at the pie chart, it's how much of the, if you split it down the middle and it's like half luck, half biology, how much of that luck part can you diminish? Like how much can you really lean into the biology and lean into what fish are more likely to react to? And I think sometimes, it's not going to make sure that you guarantee you have a good day, but it's going to obviously help you in the long run. So what we're going to talk about today, first, why should you choose topwater? Well, one, you're going to appeal to that fish's primal instincts. Like there are certain techniques you're going to have. If you're out there, in 30 foot of water with a jig head minnow, I feel like you're appealing more to the feed mentality of that fish, where they're going up, they're getting a good look at it, they're really trying to decide, okay, am I going to take this chance and am I going to give it one bite as I stare it, in the face for 15 seconds, where with topwater, it's a split reaction. So you're really trying to make sure that you just whatever's ingrained in that DNA of that fish, that you got to tick it for half a second and get that fish to commit to something, and it's over. So I feel like it's just two different worlds that you're in sometimes, and I like this world a lot more. It's objectively more fun to go out and catch fish that want to go out and absolutely kill something and go, from 5 feet under the water to the surface of the water, break the surface, and look like you just dropped a bowling ball in the water. So this is the side of fishing that I absolutely love. But I do think you're appealing more to the fight mentality of that fish versus feed. The second is that fish feed up. So obviously just the way that a fish's face is made and their biology, they are going to have a better tendency of eating something above them than below them. Now that doesn't mean that they won't go down and eat something below them, because they will. We've all thrown jigs and Texas rigs and dragged the bottom with a Ned rig, and they'll go down there and they'll nose on it. But even when they do that, you see they basically kind of do this. They go down because you got those eyes on top of the head and they're getting to look at it. Fish are way more likely, if something piques their interest above them, to have that vertical up versus down, I feel like. So you're really playing into that too, which obviously ups your chances. You get to experience visual eats. So this was something that I learned a long time ago when I first started fishing for muskie, was that it's just a different experience when you actually see the moment that something eats your bait. Like when you're muskie fishing and you've got that figure 8 going and a 45-inch, fish of pure muscle comes out and just T-bones something, that's a totally different experience than if you would cast out, 500 feet out there and you let it go all the way out and then you get hit and you can't see anything, right? It's just a totally different experience. The same thing happens when you're fishing like a glide bait. That's why a lot of people like glide bait fishing, It's sort of at the top end of the water column. A lot of times you can see those fish come up and actually eat that bait. And so it's the same thing with topwater. There's no mistaking whether or not what you just saw was a nibble or, a rock or something like that. You don't have that issue with topwater. You know that was a fish. It's just a matter of, did it get it or did it miss it? And do you have to kind of wait and give that fish a second chance to come back and hit it? And then you can fish where others can't. And this is a big part of fishing in general, right? This is why when I was growing up, like, we loved to fish small creeks and, you know, small feeder systems, because again, big boat guys weren't getting up there. It was a place we kind of had to ourselves. Sort of the same thing with topwater. There are a lot of places that you can fish topwater that you just can't fish anything else. You go to a pond and it's completely scummed over, and there's, you know, it just looks gross. There's only almost one or two things you can really do at that pond, one of which is to throw a frog and have the most fun day of your life. But you can fish where you can't throw a drop shot right there, right? You can't throw a crankbait right there. But you can go where others can't in terms of like the lure selection that you can use. So when you are at, you know, those ponds or those places where it's just you can't get away with throwing a lot of subsurface stuff, you can throw topwater. So kind of the same thing, you know, we're like river rats, you know, where I grew up and where we fish. So heavy current, it's kind of the same thing. There's a lot of situations where you can't really throw a whole lot. If you're right below a big low head dam or something and it's just gushing, you can throw a buzzbait, a popper, a plopper, a spook, but you can't really work a lot of subsurface baits very well in, you know, this deep of water when it's just absolutely gushing past you. You can throw topwater there and pick up fish. And then the last one, it's fun. And there's no explanation needed for that. This is why you like get up in the morning, you know, at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. on a summer morning on your one day off a week, and you really wish you could sleep in, but you know that if you go out in like, you know, an hour and a half when the sun rises and you can catch a, you know, topwater smallmouth or a largemouth and have it absolutely just primally just destroy something on top of the water, that's what you wake up for. So obviously just a reason why you want to go topwater fishing. Types of topwater. So I want to break this down because I think there's really two categories that most topwaters fall into. The first are going to be straight retrieve baits. So these are baits that you're actually going to retrieve in a straight line, and there's little to no side-to-side motion to them. You are like point A to point B. Where my cast lands to back to the boat or back to the bank, that is really like my potential strike zone, is just that straight line. And so with these, the interesting part is most of the action of a straight retrieve bait is done with your reel. There's very little rod things going on with these straight retrieve baits. It's more of just your speed of your reeling, your cadence of how quickly or unquickly, I guess, you're picking up that line. That's really what's kind of the variation in your retrieve. So these baits are obviously like a buzz bait, a great example. Again, you're going to cast it out. Now this is where reel comes into play a lot more, because with something like a buzz bait doesn't float, which means you do need to keep like kind of a fairly steady to fast retrieve on a buzz bait for a buzz bait to physically do what a buzz bait should be doing. So that's where you want a little bit faster reel. You're probably looking at more of a 7-to-1 or an 8-to-1 gear ratio on your bait casters usually if you're going with something like a buzz bait, just because you physically need to pick line up faster to keep that bait at the top of the water column. Prop baits and chop baits, those have become so much more important and so much more popular in the past, you know, I don't know, 4 years, probably 5 years, when the Whopper Plopper comes on the market, and then every other company in the world decides that they want to make one too. And now there's 27 different variations of this prop bait that's really, you can call them a chop bait too. If you ever watch videos of like guys going and fishing in the Amazon for peacock bass, they're throwing these big, you know, musky choppers basically. And so there's a little different retrieve on that, because a lot of those guys with the big choppers, you are kind of like, you're giving it this and you're letting it stop and letting it stop. Where with bass on the side of things, what we're usually doing for prop baits and chop baits, it's a lot more of a steady retrieve. It's just a matter of are you slowing it down, are you speeding it up, are you killing it a little bit every once in a while. Even if you are, it's still really done with your reel and not with your rod. And then wake baits. I'm going to put this in here. I know technically they might not be topwater just by the definition of their name, but if you've got a bait, you know, like a 1.5 style bait, like it looks like a crankbait, but the bill is obviously, instead of, you know, a 1.5 crankbait where the bill is usually like that, they're kind of full straight down, and then those baits don't really dive under the water almost at all. They just stay right below the water's surface. The act of that fish hitting a wake bait is very similar, if not almost the same as a topwater at that point. So you're still getting that, a lot of times, breach of that fish and breaking the surface of the water when they're hitting those wake baits. So those are all straight retrieve baits. So when do you choose a straight retrieve bait over something that may go a little bit more side to side? I'm going to pick it up when I want to cover a lot of water. So there's certain times a year where you're just going to want to cover water. There's certain times a day where you're just going to want to cover water. So, when those fish are actively feeding, which I think we'll probably get to here in a second, when you're around actively feeding fish, you do want to, the name of the game is just how many square feet, I guess, of water can I cover? How many different fish can I get, or potential fish, can I get this bait in front of on any given cast? And so you really are just trying to maximize your time and maximize your cast. You're not really trying to keep that bait in the same spot for a whole lot of time. You're just trying to cover water. That's where straight retrieve baits really come into play. Actively feeding fish is going to be spring, fall, or like your dawn and dusk of a summer afternoon or something like that. When you're running out of time, this is where it's like you're in the last 10 minutes of daylight and you got to be back home and you're like, but these fish should be eaten. I'm probably going to pick up a straight retrieve bait more so than some of the other ones we're going to talk about in a second, just because of the fact that I can cover so much more water with those when I only have 10 or 15 minutes left to go. And then when you're using it as a search bait, it kind of goes without saying too, but when you just have no idea where to start and you're on a new body of water and you know that they're hitting top water, one of the things you can do is like a straight retrieve bait is just a great way to cover a bunch of water, similar to like you might use a chatterbait as one, or something where you can just burn and try and find where those fish are, and then you can zero in a little bit more and say, okay, I've found my general area, now I can slow it down, or I can kind of pick it apart a little bit more. When you just have no idea where to start, something like straight retrieve topwater for the right time of year is a great thing to pick up. So, what are some favorite straight retrieve topwater baits? This is where it's fun. I'm not sponsored by anybody, so we can talk about any baits we want to talk about. So we've got actual brands in here. So one of my favorites, honest to goodness, on a buzz bait is just a Booyah Buzz. It's like $4.99 or whatever it is, and trying to maximize bang for your buck wise, with also just giving you that tried and true buzz bait profile that you're looking for. The one thing on a Booyah Buzz that's interesting is it's got a clacker. So this is going to be a very loud buzz bait. And if you've never thrown a buzz bait before and you have no confidence in a buzz bait, a lot of times a clacker is pretty intimidating because you're like, not only did I not think the bass was going to come up and eat this giant, piece of wire and skirt and big blade, but now I've got this other thing that's hitting it going as it's going. So, but I love a Booyah Buzz bait. I've probably caught more fish on a Booyah Buzz than any other just normal, brand buzz bait out there. For $4.99, I don't think you can go wrong with them. One of the things that we did a couple years ago is I have a buddy that owns a company up in northwestern Ohio near Bowling Green, and it's called Jig Masters. And when I was growing up, we used to take the Strike King Mini Pro Buzz, I think is what they were called. Just like a 3-inch micro buzz bait that's almost made for it's not made for crappie, but it's basically made for crappie. You catch 3 fish on it, it's done, and it's mangled, never going to be the same again. But they're like, $3 or whatever. We used to take those when I was little, and we would go out in the creeks and we'd rip the skirt off of them, and we'd put like a 3-inch Mr. Twister or buzz or a little grub or something on the back of it, and that's what we'd throw around in the creeks. And for the longest time, we waited for someone to make a good version of this that actually held up to more than one fish. I don't need a skirt on it. It's got a screw lock on it, so it keeps your soft plastic on there better. That's what I love when I'm trying to downsize things. So there are times a year where just those fish key in on small bait. Fall is a big time for that. So this is a bait that I'll reach to if I want something smaller than like a traditional buzz bait. And then we talked about it earlier, the Berkley Chopo. I think right now around us, if you put 4, 5, 6 different prop baits side by side, I think the Chopo for just the general fishing that I'm doing, I think it outfishes a river to sea whopper plopper or any of those things. I have this theory that I think fish around us at least got hip to the actual whopper plopper, that deep cup and that deep pop that it has. It's just got a very distinct sound to it. And then you reach for something like a Chopo that's got a little bit thinner sound, maybe because it's cheaper, I don't know, but it's actually just completely different sound in the water, and I think sometimes that helps you a little bit. So you got to switch stuff up. So those are my 3 favorite straight retrieve baits. Now, the second style of baits are going to be more, I don't know what to call them, so I'm going to call them twitch style baits. And these are baits where you're not going to have as much of like a straight arrow, I guess, or a straight line of how your bait's being retrieved. These are baits that you're going to work with some sort of twitch or some sort of cadence, and that's what's going to impart the action on this lure. So that unlike the straight retrieve baits, this is going to be more with your rod. So this is where your rod becomes really important. But these type of baits, I'm a lot of times out there throwing like 6, 8 to 7 foot medium rod. I'm a short guy, obviously, as you can tell. So like, I need something that's not 7'3" or 7'6" as I'm sitting here working this spook or working something. Because one, I don't want to hit the water. I don't want to hit the boat. I don't want to hit the kayak or the bank or whatever. So you're working this rod at an angle down like this. So you got to be cognizant of that too. A lot of times a shorter rod for this is what you're going to reach for. So obviously in this category, spooks, everybody knows. Poppers, I'm going to put poppers in this because even though, yes, you can straight chug a popper, I guess, if you really want to, most poppers, if you sit there and pop it, you're going to see some side-to-side in them, and that's where you get some really nice poppers and some expensive poppers that do that a little bit better than others, because the thing is, when you've got a popper that can go side-to-side, you can keep it in the same spot for longer, and you can really milk that strike zone that we'll talk about in a second. And then frogs, same thing too. So you're going to walk a frog a lot of times. That's why a lot of guys will tell you when you're trimming the legs on your frog, you want to trim one a little bit shorter than the other. It's just going to help it walk just a little bit better. You usually want your frogs to walk. So these are going to be more of what we're going to call twitch style baits for this. So now, obviously, it's kind of the opposite of before, but when do you choose a twitch style bait? So I'm going to choose a twitch style bait when I have some sort of isolated cover or structure or something I'm looking at that's like, that should be the spot that I really want to target. Because with the straight retrieve baits, you're only in that strike zone if you're reeling a buzz bait or something, and I've got a 4 foot by 4 foot area that's got a log jam or a stump under it or something. I want to really milk that area as much as possible sometimes. That's where I'm going to pick more of like a twitch style bait that'll really kind of stay there and just let me stay in that strike zone. So that's what I'll do. Same thing, if you've got like, I guess you could put current seams in this or eddies or things like that. Any place that you really want to have more of a chance of fishing that spot longer on the same cast, I'm going with the twitch style bait. Obviously, when you have smaller strike zones, that goes without saying too. And there's things under the water that are going to give you different strike zones too. Ledges, points, humps, anything that's below there that you're thinking that's what's keeping those fish in that certain spot, well then directly above it is a great strike zone that you might want to milk a little bit longer. When you have more pressured fish, there's just going to become times where fish are going to be a little bit more finicky, and maybe those fish are so pressured they don't want to go chase down a big buzz bait or a prop bait or something that's more aggressive, and you really do have to coax those fish a little bit more. Unfortunately, I know I wish that all topwater was, like we said, that super primal strike. Sometimes you do have to get a little bit finessey with them. That's where these twitch style baits will obviously help you out too. And then when the water's colder, unfortunately, when the water is colder, those metabolisms slow down a little bit. Those fish are less likely to be aggressive, but the other thing is it doesn't mean that they won't be aggressive. So like with, topwater in general, there's nothing to say that you can't go out there right now and catch a fish on topwater in the right situation. But in colder water, they're just generally going to be slower. They're going to be more lethargic. They've already fed up for the winter. They're just going to be a little less aggressive. So when the water is colder, kind of the same thing with like crankbaits. When you fish your crankbaits and the water's cold in the spring, a lot of people will go to that flat-sided crankbait because it's a little bit tighter shimmy. It's kind of the same thing with topwater, right? When it's colder, when you're toward the very beginning or the very end of topwater season, sometimes you got to slow down a little bit. So what are our favorite twitch style baits? One of them is going to be the good old head and Zara spook. So there's a bunch of spooks on the market. Most of them will do exactly what you want it to do. I mean, you can go out tomorrow and you can get a dowel rod and you can throw a couple hooks in it and cut it. And if you work it right, it will go back and forth. So there's really not a ton to say that's like super innovative on the spook side of things, but just a good old head and Zara spook. The only thing that I like about the Zara spooks versus like a super spook is that the Zara spook is silent. So when I'm around pressured fish, around here in Ohio, we're around a lot of pressured fish, I like a silent spook. Now, another thing to think about though is no spook is silent, because what does it have on it? It's got hardware on it. So every single bait that has hardware on it is not going to be silent. Go under the water, listen to it, and you're going to have some sort of sound coming off of this, but you have less. So if the guy in front of you or the girl in front of you is out there throwing a giant super spook, and then you come behind him and you can clean up some fish behind because you've got a little different sound profile, sometimes that's good too. Next, Again, good old-fashioned Rebel Pop-R. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the Pop-R is still one of the best poppers on the market. $7.99, tried and true. Now, if you can find old Pop-Rs, you can have a lot of people from back in the day that'll be like, if you can find the old ones, those were the best. That's what we'll talk about here in a second. I made to try to recreate that, and the price reflects that, obviously. But Rebel Pop-Rs, great. I've got Pop-Rs in my box right now that are probably caught 200, 300 fish, and they're still going strong. For $7.99, I'll pay that all day. Now here's where it gets real expensive. So if you want a bait, and this is something if you'd have told me 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I was going to throw a $25 popper, I would have told you you were high and you needed to leave me alone. But here we are, and I throw every once in a while Lavina Lures Rico. So this is a bait Rick Clunn, back in the day, he tried to basically recreate the original Pop-R. And there's a lot of people that'll tell you, people that fished the original Pop-R before they destroyed the molds and before they changed everything, there was just something magical about those old Pop-Rs. And so Lavina Lures is a company that basically tried to recreate that with Rick's help. So they're $25. They're very expensive. The only thing that gives me a little bit of peace of paying $25 for a topwater bait is that I'm not usually going to lose it. A topwater bait, I mean, I've got topwater baits that I've had for 10 plus years, right? Unless you make a big mistake and you throw it in a tree, which you probably shouldn't do, or you run into like a pike or something, which we don't have a ton of around here, that lure should last you a long, long time. So when I try to justify it for myself, I think, all right, if I can get that lure to last me 3 years, how many bags of soft plastics did I go through in that time? How many fish did I catch on those, 10 bags of soft plastics at $2.50 a piece? Or, I can kind of justify it in my mind a little bit for some topwater, maybe. Again, not for everybody. If you're looking to take that next step, it is just something I found that I really like. Again, price range reflects that, obviously, unfortunately. And then the last one, if you're looking for a frog, my go-to frog is always, for the past, however many years, has been the Booyah Pad Crasher. $7.99. The thing about frogs is that you're going to want to look for the right thickness of the frog that suits the cover that you're fishing. And so around here, we're not fishing Lake Okeechobee. We're not fishing any of these crazy places. We have weeds, but on the giant scale of weeds that you can have, we're usually on the lower end in terms of intensity. So the Booyah Pad Crasher, it's a softer frog. So that's a frog that collapses easier. It's easier to get that hook penetration versus something like a Spro Bronze Eye, for example. That's a bait that's probably a couple dollars more expensive, but that's a more firm frog. So if you're around super heavy cover and you're really worried about the frog getting snagged or it collapsing and you're picking up a bunch of gunk, then you want to go for a harder frog. So for me around here, I love Pad Crashers. They also make a junior size and a smaller version, but those are my favorite Twitch style baits that you're probably going to see with me every day. So now line choice. What line should you throw each of these with? So there's going to be some arguments on this, but I'll give you both sides of it, I guess. So poppers, there are going to be people that throw it on mono, and there are going to be people that throw it on braid. I like to throw them on braid just because I think it casts a little easier. Mono, there's nothing wrong with mono, but just know that if you're throwing it on braid, then you've got to be cognizant of that. Set your drag right, because the one thing that you don't want to do is rip the trebles out of that fish's mouth because you got a little too eager. So if you're using braid, you're usually going to set your drag a little bit lighter. If you're using mono, you can kind of beef it up a little bit because mono does have that stretch that braid doesn't have. So those are usually my go-tos, 10 to 14 pound if I'm in the mono range. It's really interesting. We did an episode with Rick Clunn actually a couple years ago. I think he said he throws 17-pound mono only on poppers. He's a heavy mono. This is where this gets fun, because you ask Rick, what gear do you like to throw a popper on? Polar opposite of what I like to throw a popper. He throws it on like a 7-foot heavy casting rod, like a frog rod, basically. Like I would never in my life would I throw it on that, but you can't argue with someone like Rick Clunn. So he's right, I'm wrong. But then you go to like spooks, sort of the same thing. I'm going to throw line choice anyway, very similar on poppers and spooks. Rod choice, maybe not so much, we'll get to here in a second, but same thing. I'm going to go like anywhere from 10 to 14 pound mono. You can go 10, maybe a little beefier if you want to on braid. Again, just make sure that your hook set reflects what line you're picking and your reel settings reflect what line you're picking. Buzz baits. So I think most people are going to throw them on braid. I think if you ask the general consensus is probably somewhere in that 20 to 40 pound braid. I'm going to tell you, and this is something that I started doing a couple years ago, and you're not going to convince me it doesn't matter. I throw it on fluoro a lot because I've already got that rod set up with me for something else usually. So like the rod that I would like to throw a buzzbait on is probably 7 foot to 7.3. It's medium heavy, it's fast, and then I've already got that in my lineup because I'm probably throwing jigs or Texas rigs on that rod anyway. I don't want to have another rod that has a completely different line on it just to throw buzzbaits on. So instead, I'll just throw it on that fluoro that I probably already have on that Texas rig rod or on that jig rod, somewhere around anywhere from 12 to 20. I've probably got 14 to 16 on mine most of the time around there. But the fact that the reason that a buzzbait floats or is up on top of the water is because of the speed that you're retrieving it. It has nothing to do with what line you choose. So with some of these other ones, like, if it's I don't know, a good example, like a popper. So a popper floats on its own. Buzzbait does not float on. So the only reason that it's up there is because you're reeling it fast. So when you're reeling it fast, I don't care if my line floats or sinks. It doesn't matter because the tension is there. So that property doesn't really make a big difference to me. Fluoro doesn't have a whole lot of stretch, which is great for buzzbaits too because it's got a single stout hook on it. So you really can set the hook a little harder. That's kind of my preference for buzzbaits. The one that I think is not up for debate is frogs. I think there is a very general consensus among all fishing that heavy braid is what you should choose for frogs. When you're frog fishing, you are in heavy cover usually. You're in scummy, weedy water, and the name of the game is how hard can you set the hook to drive those hooks home, and then how much tension can you keep on that fish and not let it get any sort of slack in the line or anything like that, because that's when you lose a frog fish. So it is just forcing that fish in as fast as you can, as hard as you can, hand-to-hand combat with that fish. 50 to 65 pound braid. I'm usually running 65 is what I do on my frog rods. So rod choice then, next logical thing to talk about would be poppers. You can do either one. I know a lot of people that really prefer to throw poppers on casting gear. I know myself, I prefer spinning rods. The thing that you're going to have to think about is why you're throwing that popper. Are you throwing that popper to try and just cast as far as you can and cover as much water? Or are you throwing that popper because it's a very specific spot that you're really trying to flip and there's a stump or a laydown or something right there? If you're really trying to flip and hit a specific spot, then yeah, a casting rod makes more sense because you just have more accuracy with a casting rod. But with me, a lot of times with a popper, I'm on the banks or whatever, and I'm just bombing it as far as I can. If I put the same popper on the same line and I put one on my casting setup, one on my spinning setup, I'm going to be able to throw it farther on my spinning setup. So a lot of times I just end up throwing it on a spinning rod. Spooks, I think most people are going to tell you casting. You can throw it on a spinning rod. There's nothing wrong with throwing it on a spinning rod, but just a spook is heavy enough usually that you don't really have to worry about the casting distance too much. If throwing a super spook or something, it's going to go to Mars no matter what you cast it on, so it's fine. So a lot of times though, it's way more comfortable for me to have a reel that I can palm in my hand and work as I'm working a spook versus have a spinning rod that I've got the reel below it and it doesn't feel quite as comfortable. Buzzbaits, same thing, casting for the most part. If you're throwing a little micro buzzbait or something, you can throw it on a spinning rod. Most people are going to throw it on casting, and then there's no question frogs should be thrown on casting rods. So when to throw topwater in general, the first thing I want to say, anybody who tells you there's a magic temperature where fish start hitting topwater is lying to you, or they're wrong, or they're misinformed. There is no magic temperature for topwater at all. I have caught topwater fish in December when there's snow on the ground. Now, is it the best thing to be throwing there? No, but certain situation, I can think of one a couple years ago. We were fishing a creek that was literally, probably a foot deep. And there's just really not a whole lot we could throw right there. And I threw a little spook out there and just got absolutely annihilated for 45 minutes straight with these fish. Because again, when you're in shallower water, it's harder to ignore topwater. It's not as far of a chase. It's not as much effort. It's literally going right by their face because they're in a foot of water and it's right above them. So it's not that big of a deal. But there is no magic temperature. It's not, when the water temperature hits 50 or 55 or 60 degrees, you should start throwing topwater. It's all dependent on your situation. here in Ohio, again, we talked about it earlier, I would say like mid-spring to late fall is usually when I'm throwing topwater. This is something, though, that really frustrates me because it's been changing each year, I feel like. I feel like when I used to start throwing topwater when I was even younger, I feel like it was earlier. And now every year it seems like it's a little bit later before those fish really get hot on topwater. And then I guess kind of the same thing is it seems like maybe it lasts a little longer in the fall too. So it's almost like that season has just shifted a little bit. I don't know if it's a couple weeks or what, but I just know that growing up, I feel like once you got to, late March, early April, like you could start throwing topwater. Now I feel like these fish, yeah, you can catch some, but I feel like it's a little bit later than that now. So again, all relative. Spring, I'm going to throw a lot of topwater in the evening for the simple reason that in the spring the water is warming. So you really want to play into that. So throughout the day, that water temperature is going up. So when you're looking at low 40s and then starting to get into the 50s and early low 50s, well then you want to maximize that water being as warm as possible. The warmer the water, I think, the more likely they are to hit topwater. So in the spring, that's usually the evening. Summer, you're just going on photo periods, so the light period of that day. So a lot of times it's low light when those fish are really going to be active. That's not to say that there aren't other times, and we'll get to that in a second, where there's definitely exceptions to this, but your hottest times that you're actually going to want to throw topwater are usually going to be morning and evening. In the summer, fall, all dang day. Throw topwater as much as you want all day long in the fall. There are going to be days when you can just go out in the fall and never put the topwater down. And those are, again, the days that I think we live for sometimes. But yeah, fall is probably my favorite time if you made me pick one to throw topwater in general. And then there's going to be some exceptions here. So like the exception would be like for the summer. If you're frogging, there's no morning and evening part of this. These fish are under mats and they're just waiting for something to go above them and they're tracking it below there. You can throw a frog all day long in the summertime. You can have a great day on a frog at 1 p.m. when it's 100 degrees outside with a frog. So that's great. Same with moving water. If you're around moving water, that's kind of a different equalizer too, where it's not like the stagnant lake fish, right? It's just this thing that invigorates, I feel like, that ecosystem a lot more, where they play by their own set of rules and they're a little bit more aggressive. Fall, I would say morning and evening, even though you can throw it all day long, are still going to be better because, again, you're just capitalizing on those more active periods of those fish. So where would you throw topwater? For me, I love throwing topwater in just shallow water, again, like we talked about a second ago, for the sheer fact that it's just harder for that fish to ignore my topwater bait if it's less of a distance between them and the top of the surface of the water. So you can coax a lot more fish to come up and eat topwater if you're throwing it, if they're down at a log down there and you're in 4 foot of water and they look at it, versus if you're trying to throw it over a brush pile in 20 foot of water, right? It just kind of makes sense. So I like shallow water. I like main lake points a lot. I like bombing something, a big spook or something, over a main lake point and working it back to you. Main lake points are one of those really cool spots on a lot of these lakes around here, especially in Ohio, where you're going to have fish that have access to a lot of different depths of water without moving a whole lot. So you've got lakes, we can talk about after this, I won't do it right here. You've got specific lakes where there are lakes out in the middle. You've got a point that comes all the way out in the middle of that lake, and you might almost be able to stand in the middle of that lake without even knowing it, because it's like 3 foot deep right there, because this big point comes up and then it drops off to like 20 feet, right? And those fish can just kind of use that all day long to slide up and down where they want. So I like those types of areas a lot. Directly above submerged structure and cover obviously makes sense, right above a brush pile or something where fish are going to be. In fast current, again, like we talked about, fast current fish are just active, mean fish. And so they feel like a lot of times they have a better tendency to reach up and grab that topwater. Around heavy weeds and vegetation, for the simple fact there's not a lot else you can do around there, so that's really the big choice you're going to take. So that is your frogs, that is things like buzz baits. Eddies and current seams. As, again, a river guy, this is where a lot of those fish sit. This is like the hot spot for them. An eddy is basically like a place where a fish can sit and there's a giant buffet of bait that just goes past them all day long on that current seam. And they can sit there and just decide when they want to come out and ambush something. Use those to your benefit too. Great places to throw topwater. So topwater tips in general, just some fun stuff. So poppers and spooks, I really prefer a feathered treble on the back of these things. I feel like it just helps them have something to target other than the actual body of the lure itself. Something just kind of dangles out there, looks a little bit more natural. Might be like a little tail or something there. So I like feathered trebles a lot. I feel like I have, I don't know if it's a confidence thing or what, but I feel like I've caught more fish with a back feathered treble than without one. Throw a snap on like a popper or something. So I get a lot of flack a lot of times because I like to throw snaps on just about everything, but this is one of those situations that I think it really helps. I think with like a popper or a spook where you're really trying to get that bait to move back and forth, more free range of motion at the line tie helps a little bit. So if you are walking a popper or spook, just try it. Throw a snap on there and see if it makes any difference for you. Buzz baits. I'm a big fan of buzz baits with no skirt on them. So even like the booyah that I was talking about earlier, I'll rip the skirt off that all the time and go for more of like a soft plastic on the trailer of my buzz bait than a skirt. I just like that. If you're gonna leave the skirt on, I do like to add a trailer hook. I've seen a lot of fish on buzz baits come on my trailer hook and not on my actual hook. So it's something that just gives me a little bit more confidence, a little less short strikes on those fast buzz baits. And then frogs, one of the things, one of the best tips that I saw, this a couple years ago, and now there have been a couple pro guys that have done it. For a while, it was a little bit more hush-hush. People were taking the legs of those frogs, ripping the silicone legs out of it, and then taking jig rattles. So the things that you usually put on the collars and stuffing them in the legs of that frog. And so the frog still looks like it has two legs, but they're just jig rattles that stick out there and they super glue them in there. And so it gives it a lot more sound as it's coming across those grass mats. So that, and then again, if you buy something like, we were talking earlier, Spro frog, and it's too stiff for you or something, you can boil those frogs a lot of times like on your kitchen stove and they'll soften up a little bit. So that's kind of like real quick rundown of topwater in general, and again, it's my favorite way to fish. I think if you made me choose one way to fish for the rest of my life, I would sit out, fall or late fall, summer, and like super early spring, just so I could have the best times of year to fish topwater. I think it's like the best thing in the world. So I appreciate you guys coming over. And then anybody have any questions or anything? Yeah. Do I use scent? I'll use scent sometimes, not on topwater. I won't ever. Now there are people that make they almost look like chapstick, right? That you can like rub on baits and stuff. Science is still out there on a lot of that stuff. Depends on who you talk to and what company they work for, whether they tell you that stuff actually works or not. But I don't put a lot of stock in scent in general. Like I just don't. May it make a difference? Maybe. I just don't know enough, and I've caught enough fish on unscented baits that I've got the confidence it doesn't matter. I feel like fish are a lot more of visual eaters than they are of scent-based stuff. The thing that I'm reading a book right now by a biologist, and there's a whole chapter where he talks about how fish process scent. And the thing that's like scent is basically they're just in a soup of scent all day long. They have really, really good, I don't know what to call it, scent receptors or whatever in their nose, but they're just bombarded by so many things all the time that they kind of describe it as like scent is more of something that can turn off a fish than can turn on a fish to bite your bait. So same with taste too. They have taste buds obviously. So like they always talk about the oils on our hands. Humans are just dirty, greasy, smelly, gross things. So when you're touching that soft plastic as you're rigging it up, they've observed fish a lot of times that will turn away from that sort of grease that we leave on baits. So I guess if you're going to use scent, I look at it more like to mask anything bad versus be something good where like the fish is going to be, from 13 feet away, be like, oh, there we go, and go toward it. So that's kind of how I look at scent usually. Yeah.
What about leaders? If you're fishing braid, whether topwater or not, like, are you using leaders?
Yeah. I'd be lying if I said I don't use leaders, but it's just out of laziness. It's just because I don't want to change what I already have on there. So a lot of times, like with my spinning rods, we do a lot of wet weighting and, we go through the creeks and stuff. And usually we'll take one rod with us. And so when you only have one rod, a lot of times we'll take a spinning rod and it's braid with a fluoro leader on it. And so that's just like my go-to. So I have it with me. Do I take that leader off to throw the stuff? No, I leave it on, right? It doesn't matter. A popper's still going to float regardless if it's got a little bit of fluorocarbon in the front of it or not. It's okay. There's no real situations where I feel like you have to have a leader. The only thing, it's not really bass. It would be like, I guess, if I was fishing for pike or muskie or something, then just those teeth they have, or I guess walleye is a good example too. The teeth that they have, like because of the serration of them and just how sharp they are, I know it seems counterintuitive, but they cut through braid like butter, and they seem to not cut through fluorocarbon or mono as much. So if it's like to keep your topwater from being stolen by a pike, if you're around, pike heavy fisheries, that might make sense. But I don't think because topwater is so primal, I don't think, unless it really is like a popper that you're working super hard on this one stump and you're letting that fish get a real good look at it, most fish are committing before they have the chance to go up and get line shy on it. So I don't really worry about it too much. Yeah.
When you're fishing on the river for smallmouth, generally, like for instance, like hard body school or hard body top bait,
what's the largest size? What's the largest size of topwater I'll curling up there on the river for smallies? So the cool part about smallies is there is no bait too big. And that's what I love about smallies. It took me a long time to realize it. As long as it's got trebles, there's no bait too big, because they will try to eat it. You can throw a big single hook bait. You can throw a giant frog all day long if you want. They'll try to eat it. You're not going to hook many of them because they obviously have smaller mouths, and it's not going to be a great time. But if it's got trebles on it, you can throw as big a darn bait as you want. I can throw the biggest spook in my box for smallmouth, and they will come up and crush it. I've got over at the booth, I've got some saltwater baits that I actually got from a buddy that lives down in Florida, because 2 falls ago we were on a really good topwater bite, and I was like, I bet I can get these fish to eat almost anything. And so I got him to throw me some of those like giant pencil popper type things that they had. I had smallmouth coming up and trying to just send this thing into the next dimension. So there's no bait that's too big. You just have to make sure that those fish are going to go up and try and attack it. You just have to make sure that it's trebles so that you can actually hook them. You don't have to make them eat this full bait to be able to get hook penetration. I think that's a big thing. Same thing with glide baits and stuff. That's what I learned too. I've got plenty of 8-inch, 10-inch smallmouth on 7-inch glide baits. Like, they will come up and try and eat it. You just have to have the right hardware to hook them. Yeah. Anybody else have anything? Yeah. Color for topwaters. I'm going to say there's 3 colors that you need in topwater. I would say that's it. That's all I'm going to need. White. I'll go white, black, and some sort of natural bait fish, silver type color. But a lot of times I'm throwing bone or black for the most part. I just think it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's what I've been throwing my whole life. And there are certain situations, super dirty water, that I'll lean into a black. There's some days, like sunny days, a lot of times I'll lean into black too, just because my brain goes to, if a fish is below that topwater bait and they're seeing that spook or that buzzbait or whatever on top of the water, all they're really seeing is contrast and shadow anyway, because they're below the bait looking up at a bright sunny day. They're just seeing the outline of it. So why not just accentuate that, right? Make it as dark as possible and go about your day. So a lot of times I will go black, but again, a bone and more of a silvery bait fish type color. That's really the only 3 colors to keep most of the stuff. Yeah.
What about like the style baits?
Yeah, it's a good point. Obviously, we live in Ohio too, so Arbogast, and it's a big thing around here. It's just something that's fallen out of style, to where I'd be lying if I said that I keep one with me a lot of times, but I also be lying if I said they don't catch fish, because they do. So sometimes the fun part about fishing is letting things die out of style so that the fish haven't seen them in a long time, and then you come back around, years and years later, and oh, look at this. This generation of fish hasn't seen a jitterbug ever. Like, this is great. This is like when we first threw jitterbugs. So yeah, jitterbugs definitely work. Those sort of like wobbling baits too. I mean, you're getting into stuff like the megabass eye wing, or like big crawlers or stuff like that. I mean, the things that bass will eat on top of the water are comical almost. Some of these ones that look like the bird that's just going like this, and then you see fish come up like they've never eaten before and want to try and kill this thing. So yeah, the jitterbugs definitely work. I'd say they probably fall more in straight retrieve baits, obviously, in terms of what I'm going to do with them, even though they do kind of go side to side. It's just not a completely straight arrow, just the action of the bait. Kind of similar to like a weight bait, right? A lot of weight baits do that too, just kind of go side to side, even though all I'm doing is straight retrieve reel and bits. But they definitely work. Yeah.
What's your favorite nighttime topwater? I know a lot of people.
Favorite nighttime topwater, a black buzzbait. Black buzzbait. There's something about black at night too. Don't know what it is. Same thing with spinnerbaits. My whole life, we grew up throwing black single Colorado blade spinnerbaits at night. That was like all you threw if you're going to throw a spinnerbait at night. I don't know why, but that's what we always did. And so I kind of take that to buzzbaits too. If you can find like a black buzzbait with a black blade, I love it. Yeah.
I want to catch my new biggest bass this year. What lure would you throw?
Your biggest bass this year you want to catch, what lure would you throw? What are you fishing? You fishing lakes, ponds?
Mostly ponds.
Ponds? Does your pond have weeds?
Some, actually not.
All right. I would say, I mean, if you can get out there with some sort of like harnessed swim bait, so like a pole shad or a mag grab or something like that, something that's going to elicit a bigger bite. Now, there are days you're going to want to go out there and just catch fish, and that's totally fine. But if you want to target big fish, there is something to be said for bigger baits typically lead to overall your average bigger fish size offers. It might make for more frustrating days because you're not going to catch as many, but there's a great chance some of my biggest fish my entire life obviously have been on big baits when I've just really said, you know what, Andrew, I'm going to set aside, today I'm not going to try and have a 30 fish day. I'm going to go out and try and catch bigs. And some days that turns out well, and some days it doesn't. Some days you go home, you're like, well, I struck out, but I tried on this. But yeah, something like a mag grab or something where you can just kind of slow crawl it. It's got a big treble below it. It's just a bigger profile for those fish. Glide baits are another great one. Go out and get you like an S waiver or something and throw those. I think, again, you're not going to have the numbers that you want, but if you want to target big fish, I would upsize your bait size. Yeah. Any tips and tricks for hookup ratios on frogs? Yes. Yes. The first thing you're going to want to do you fish around a ton of super heavy weeds cover, or just kind of like moderate stuff? Okay. What I would do, the first thing I'd do is take pliers and bend those hooks out. I would bend them, because they come flush with that bait. So if you bend them up just a little bit, not a lot, just a little bit, it's going to help a ton, because it's just going to give you that little bit of already a head start to those fish maybe getting poked a little bit more. The other thing, hook up, you got to wait. And that's the hardest thing in the world to do. When I first started frog fishing, I missed so many fish because I just jerked way too fast when it happens. Because you look at it, you're like, my frog disappeared. It's clearly got in its mouth. I can set the hook and send this thing to Mars. You can't. Like, you have to wait a minute. A lot of these fish will come up and they'll attack, and they might get the corner of the frog or the tail or the whatever, legs, whatever it is. And then when it gets under the water, you can actually watch videos of this. It will take like a secondary gulp and then fully engulf the frog in its mouth. So it'll like take it below the surface, but then it worked hard for it. It's not going to just let this thing go. So it worked hard, it goes up, it drags it below, and then there's like this secondary gulp or swallow where it gets the full thing in its mouth. That's when you set the hook. So a lot of times people will say, and I do this, you go frog fishing with me, I literally watch it blow up and I count to 3 before I set the hook. And it's hard to do because you're like, this fish has my frog. Like I'm going to miss it. What if it spits it out? That fish worked hard enough for that frog. It's going to keep it in its mouth for a second or two usually. So you see it happen, you just go 1, 2, boom. Just set the hook. Just give it an extra second or two, because if that fish is really short striking, a lot of times those fish will still make sure they get the full thing in its mouth. They just got to wait a second. So it's hard to do. The discipline is tough, but it's worth it in the end. Anybody else have anything? Yeah. Yeah, so the micro buzz up there, running sideways in the water. So all buzz baits are going to want to do that. Like, that's obviously buzz baits in general. The tendency is going to be, and it's not a bad thing. The buzz bait is not made to have the blade right above and then the hook directly, 12 to 6 below it. Obviously, it's made to go out a little bit. Those fish track the tail end of that thing, right? So they're tracking the skirt or the soft plastic. So they're not usually going to miss it. They're going for the part you actually want to hit them for. But what we did with that buzzbait is we just tried to make it so that at slower speeds, it wouldn't ride up as high as usually a buzzbait that light wants to do. Usually the buzzbait like that light just automatically wants to get up there, and there's not a lot of weight pulling it down. The other thing is whatever soft plastic you pick. So because it's so light and finicky of a bait, different soft plastics make a big difference. If you pick a heavier rub or something like Zoom's Fat Alberts are a little bit heavier, so like those types of things, or something that's got a lot of salt in it, halons, something like that. you could probably throw a Yamanuki or something from Yamamoto that's got a bunch of salt content in it. It's going to help pull that bait down because it's heavier salt plastic. So you can manipulate it a little bit, but I don't get so worried about it rising up as much as it is, am I keeping the right speed of this thing, and is the blade where I want it to be? The blade, I'm going to be like, okay, a lot of times I want that blade to just kind of be waking. That's what we really kind of made that for. It's how I fish it a lot more than just burn it like a buzzbait. Slower speeds and just kind of churning so that you get that V on top of the water. And it's not full clacking. It's just kind of right below it. So that's how I usually fish it. But yeah, different salt plastics will help you too. Have anything else? Yeah.
What do you think about the soft plastic frogs like the cement toads?
Yeah, like horny toads or something like that have been around for a while. Those are great. Those are something that I'll put on the back of a buzzbait a lot of times too. Now a lot of people will throw them just straight up. They make like the double hooks that you can put in them. Great too. So same thing. That's a good example of like a soft plastic straight retrieve bait that would be in that same category as a buzzbait or a prop bait or something like that. They are great. Same thing though that you're going to have with a soft body frog too. It's like the fish is going to eat that, and you might have to wait a second before you really just set the hook on those to make sure they get, because those are two big, beefy, stout hooks that a lot of times they'll have in those horny toads is what you rig them up with, so kind of the same thing. But with a soft frog, with a hollow body frog, with everything, it's just like power of hook set. Don't be afraid to set the hook too hard on those things. That is the name of the game in frog fishing. And everybody gets a lot of flack, these young kids that always like, everything they're doing, right? They're throwing exposed hook baits, trying to set the hook as hard as they can. The one thing that you'll usually never hear anybody say is that frog fishing is the time where that is all on the table. You set the hook as hard as you can, and you try to send that fish to the moon because you are trying to penetrate that fish with two big stout hooks, usually in weeds or heavy cover or something. So you don't want to wait for hooks. But yeah, those are great too. Those are, again, another good bait that I think was really popular for a long time and then slowly kind of fell out of races. A lot of people with new stuff came on the market, and a sneaky option if you want to pick it back up.
Yeah. Specific trailer we use on the micro buzz. Usually it's a 3-inch Mr. Twister. I'm just old school. It's just what we had growing up too, and it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's other things you can do with that though to give it different action. So like with that small little micro buzz bait we were talking about, because it's so light, the trailer that you use has a big difference. So if you use like a bait that has a lot more salt in it, it's going to be a little heavier. It's going to want to have that head go a little bit farther down. It's not going to pop up as easy. So that can give you a little bit easier if you want to wake it at slow speeds maybe. I've used the 275 big joshies, the small big joshies, and wake that around time and time again and give it more of like an actual true bait fish profile if you want to. But most of the time it's just a 3-inch Mr. Twister, white or black, and good as down before. Anybody else have anything? Yeah. Do what? Are you killing a popper when you throw it around in slack water? Usually, so a lot of times when you throw a popper, you throw it like in that slack water, and you have that super aggressive fish there. A lot of times it'll hit right away. Like most of the time, I feel like in the first couple of days is when you're really getting hit. Versus there are a lot fewer times I feel like where I'm meticulously working it back to the boat, or working it back to the kayak, and then they hit like 90% of the way in. Usually I feel like it's at the front end of the cast. But yes, you can sit there and you can leave it a lot. I'm probably a little bit more aggressive than a lot of people are with poppers. I don't know, that's just kind of like my ADHD going on. I feel like I need to keep moving it over and over again. But no, I don't kill it, full kill it a whole lot. Usually I'm still working it pretty aggressively. Yeah.
Casting it down, it's covered in water, looking at the sun, branch. Are you casting past it? Landing right?
Good question. So if you have submerged cover below the water, are you casting past it and then kind of coming up on it, or are you casting right on top of it and letting it kind of splash down on top of it? There's a couple things. I think it depends on the depth that cover is at. So if it's deeper, then a lot of times I will try and splash right down on it because I want to catch some attention. If you're 15 foot down or something, then I think you can use that to your advantage for sure. I think if you're in a little bit shallower water, obviously you want to be a little bit stealthier. But again, I can talk out both sides of my mouth on that because I can count hundreds of times that I've just thrown randomly and right on the splash pad that absolutely annihilated like in shallow water too. So I think it just depends on the fish. Sometimes they're aggressive enough that they actually want it on the splashdown, and you can use that to your advantage. But a lot of times I feel like you're going to have, most people say cast past it and work it onto it at least first, just because that looks a little bit more natural probably. It probably also depends on the bait. So like splashing down a popper probably makes a little bit more sense than splashing down a spook right on top of them. A spook, you want them to basically see that feed is the first thing you want them to see. So I guess it depends. Else have anything? Yeah. Go-to topwater for smallmouth over rocks. I honestly don't think this is, maybe it's right or wrong, I don't think the type of cover they're on below the surface really has a whole lot to do with me in terms of what topwater I choose. I think it's just more on like, all right, what's the time of year, how aggressive are they, versus, you know, I'm not going to choose one topwater if they're over rocks versus another topwater if they're over weeds or over wood or something like that usually. So I usually don't make that distinction too much. It's just usually like, okay, well, do I think that they will actually go out and chase a big buzzbait today, or am I going to have to be a little bit more stealthy with them and really work something and build something a little bit slower? But now, rock in general is a big place to target. That's definitely something you want to look for around here. But no, I don't think any situations I can think of where I would specifically say I'm going to pick this topwater because they're specifically over rock. Yeah.
Do you break your topwater down by season?
Breaking topwater down by season. Yeah, winter, don't throw it probably. In the spring, I feel like more aggressive plays a lot. So for some reason or another, I feel like I throw a lot of buzz baits in the spring. In the summertime, I end up more on the popper side of things. You slow stuff down a little bit. In the fall, I speed back up again. So you are on buzz baits and spooks. I feel like I really start to reach for a spook in the fall. And then once you get to late fall, you just get to that point where you might get a couple more days out of a popper because you're right on the edge of continuing to hit it or not. And then you get right back to winter where you're really not throwing a whole lot. The other thing is that frogs, I feel like most of the time when I throw a frog, it's like dead middle of summer. A lot of times. So that's when like the weeds are in full bloom. That's when you just have the most cover that you can go out and play around with. And yeah, that seems to be what I gravitate toward for the most part. So super aggressive, slow down, super aggressive, stop throwing topwater basically. Yeah. Yeah, would you want to use topwater in a river or creek? Yes, topwater in a river or creek, I feel like that bite lasts longer too. Those are just more aggressive fish usually. So there's something about the biology of a fish that stays in moving water. They're just built a little different. They're a little bit meaner. They have to fight a little bit harder a lot of times. They're not as lazy. So a lot of times I feel like they're just more likely to hit topwater in general. So yeah, it's a great place to throw, obviously. It's shallow, you got that working for you, you got moving water working for you, all the right things you're looking for to get a fish to come on top. Yeah. That's a good question too. Any differences between largemouth and smallmouth for topwater? Yeah, definitely. So, like the one thing you're not going to do usually is you're not going to throw like a frog for a smallmouth. So you just have to remember, again, this goes back to like the biology of like the size of the mouth, the physical size of its mouth matters. So when you're thinking of like how do you hook a smallmouth, you're probably going to want trebles most of the time. So that's the thing. There's no bait that's too big. Usually there are just hooks and hook placement that's too big. So profile, those fish will come up and try to eat. It's just a matter of whether you can actually hook them or not. So you can go out and throw a frog all day long for smallmouth, and I'm sure they'll come up and try and hit it, but your hookup rate is going to be terrible versus a largemouth that's the diameter of its mouth is probably 2 to 3 times bigger for the same weight fish. So they just have a better chance to slurp it all in, and then you actually do have the ability to set those hooks home. So the thing, yeah, like there is no spook that's too big for a smallmouth though. Like I think smallmouth, you can definitely lean into bigger baits. You just have to make sure it's a bait they can swipe at and get hooked versus actually physically have to get the bait full in its mouth. But with a largemouth, there's almost nothing too big. We've all seen largemouth with like 11-inch crappies stuck in their mouth and stuff. So they can definitely get a whole lot in there. Where smallmouth are a little bit more limited. The smallmouth are just, again, as mean as possible. They will come up and try and eat it. Just make sure you have the right hook hardware on there for them. Anybody else? Awesome. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Okay, everybody, that's the episode today. Again, massive thank you to everybody that came out and stopped by and said hi. I've said it a million times, but I'll say it again. I even said this to some folks that, while we were talking at the expo. When I record this show, like right now, I'm sitting in my studio, aka my spare bedroom, and all I see is a microphone and the wall, and that's it. And I've got like the computer screen in front of me. And then when it's over, all I see are like numbers and analytics and stuff like that. That's it. There's no real human interaction on my end, and that's why these shows and these expos are so cool to me, because I actually get to meet you all. I get to see real people and talk to real people that listen to the show. So just know that I am forever grateful for you all. I'm happy to call so many of you friends now. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for supporting the show, and thank you guys for just being awesome. So, as always, you can find us on the web, tackletalkpodcast.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Tackle Talk Podcast, and we'll see you right back here next Tuesday for another brand new episode of Tackle Talk.
Thank you for listening to the Tackle Talk Podcast. Tackle Talk is produced by Andrew Hayes. Copyright 2021. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.